The apartment building felt like its own small world, a maze of thin walls, creaking floors, and whispered secrets. I had lived here for a year, and in that time, I had become a quiet observer of my neighbors' lives. I knew the couple in 3B always fought on Thursdays, that the old man in 5C never missed his morning walk, and that my neighbor, the one with the deep voice and easy laugh, often brought home dates on Friday nights. He was the kind of guy you noticed. Tall, athletic, with a smile that seemed to hold the world's confidence. I didn't know much about him at first, just the basics. He liked classic rock, his motorcycle roared to life every weekend, and he had a habit of humming as he climbed the stairs. Despite my attempts to keep my distance, I found myself watching for him, listening for the heavy thud of his boots in the hallway. We first spoke over a flickering hallway light. I had just returned from a late shift, fumbling with my keys, when he appeared, his broad frame filling the narrow corridor. He glanced up at the flickering bulb and smirked, catching my eye for the first time. "Guess the building's finally falling apart, huh?" he said, his voice rough around the edges but not unkind. I managed a small, awkward chuckle, feeling my cheeks heat up in the dim light. "Yeah, it's been on its last leg for a while now." He nodded, leaning against the wall, his eyes lingering on me just a moment too long. For the first time, I noticed the warmth in his gaze, the way his dark eyes seemed to hold a hidden spark. It was just a passing moment, a shared observation over a broken light, but it left me unsettled. After that, I started noticing him more often, in the mailroom, at the stairwell, or passing by as I took out the trash. Our encounters remained brief but oddly charged, each one leaving my heart pounding a little harder. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a harmless crush on a straight neighbor who probably didn't think twice about me once he turned the corner. But then came the night of the power outage. I had just finished dinner when the lights cut out, plunging my small apartment into darkness. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for my phone when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, familiar. I opened my door a crack, the dim emergency lights casting long shadows, and saw him standing there, a flashlight in hand. "Hey," he called out, his voice echoing down the hall. "You good?" I hesitated for a moment, my pulse quickening at the unexpected attention. "Yeah, just caught off guard." He chuckled, his face half lit by the flashlight's beam. "Figures this place would lose power in the middle of a storm." Without thinking, I stepped into the hallway, letting the door click shut behind me. We stood there, the only sounds the distant rumble of thunder and the soft hum of the emergency lights. For a moment, it felt like the world outside had disappeared, leaving just the two of us in this strange, uncertain limbo. "Want some company?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes searching mine for a hint of something, approval, interest, maybe even a connection. I nodded before I could overthink it. "Yeah, that sounds good." We ended up sitting on the cold, chipped linoleum floor, backs against the wall, his flashlight casting long shadows across the cracked paint. He told me about his childhood in a small town, about his old dog that had passed a few years back, and about the freedom he felt on his bike, the way the wind could strip away the weight of the world. I found myself leaning in, my usual awkwardness slipping away in the dark. I told him about my job, my love for late-night walks, and my fear of being truly seen, of letting someone get too close. At some point, the flashlight between us began to flicker, casting his face into brief, dramatic shadows that made my chest tighten. He caught me looking at him, really looking, and for a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. He cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "Guess we should check on the breaker, huh?" I nodded, pulling myself back into the present, my pulse still racing. As he stood, his shoulder brushed mine, a small, fleeting touch, but enough to send a jolt down my spine. As we made our way to the basement, our footsteps echoing off the cracked tiles, I realized something had changed. It was subtle, like the first stirrings of a summer storm, but it was there. And it terrified me just as much as it thrilled me. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the shadows dancing across my ceiling, I wondered if he felt it too. The pull, the quiet, irresistible gravity drawing us closer with every shared glance and whispered word. After that night in the hallway, something unspoken lingered between us. It wasn't just the shared secrets whispered in the dark, or the way our shadows had stretched together against the cracked walls. it was more, a quiet connection that neither of us dared name. I started finding excuses to linger in the common areas, hoping for another chance encounter. I'd time my trash runs to when I thought he might be coming home, or take the stairs instead of the elevator, hoping to catch a glimpse of him on his way up. It felt ridiculous, like I was a teenager with a hopeless crush, but I couldn't seem to help myself. One evening, as I fumbled with my mailbox, struggling to yank out a stack of overdue bills and glossy junk mail, I heard the familiar thud of his boots on the staircase. I straightened up, forcing my hands to stop trembling as his shadow stretched across the wall. "Hey," he said, his voice a welcome rumble in the quiet hallway. "Mail fighting you again." I let out a nervous chuckle, shoving the crumpled envelopes under my arm. "Yeah, you'd think I'd have figured this out by now." He smirked, stepping closer, his broad shoulders blocking out the dim light behind him. "Let me help." Before I could protest, he reached past me, his arm brushing mine as he tugged open the metal mailbox door. I felt my breath catch, the warmth of his body so close, the faint smell of his cologne mixing with the stale hallway air. He pulled out a single postcard, glancing at the picture of a distant beach before handing it to me. "Guess someone's living the good life," he said, his eyes meeting mine, a playful glint hidden in their depths. I managed a shaky smile, trying not to read too much into the way his fingers lingered against mine for just a second too long as he passed the card over. "Thanks," I said, my voice coming out softer than I intended. He gave a small nod, his gaze still locked on mine, as if he was trying to read a secret I hadn't quite figured out myself. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he stepped back, his boots echoing against the tiles as he continued down the hall. I watched him go, my heart hammering in my chest, the postcard crumpling slightly in my tightening grip. I wanted to call after him, to say something that might bridge the growing gap between us, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by doubt and fear. Later that night, I found myself standing on my small, rust-streaked balcony, the cool night air brushing against my skin. I clutched the metal railing, my mind replaying every glance, every small touch, every whispered word we had shared. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something I didn't fully understand, my heart torn between the safety of silence and the danger of confession. As I stared out at the twinkling city lights, a familiar sound reached my ears, the low, throaty rumble of his motorcycle. I leaned over the railing, watching as he pulled into the parking lot below, his helmet glinting under the flickering streetlight. He looked up, his face hidden behind the dark visor, but I felt his eyes on me, a silent acknowledgement that sent a shiver down my spine. He raised his hand in a small wave before killing the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. I hesitated, my fingers tightening on the cold metal railing, before I raised my hand in return, my heart pounding so loudly I wondered if he could hear it from 3 stories below. As he disappeared into the building, I leaned back, my head spinning with 1,000 unspoken thoughts. I knew I should have turned away, should have gone inside and pretended this was nothing more than neighborly kindness. But as I stared at the empty spot where his bike had been, I realized I was already too far gone. The next day, as I made my way down the stairwell, I found a small, folded piece of paper taped to my door. My heart skipped a beat as I peeled it off, the words scrawled in his rough, familiar handwriting. "You free tonight? I've got some cold beers and a pretty decent view from my balcony. Figured you might want to join me, Jay." I leaned against the wall, the note crumpled in my shaking hand, my mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in a long while, I felt the faint flicker of hope, a fragile, dangerous thing, but one I couldn't seem to let go. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, knowing full well that if I took this step, there might be no going back. I spent the rest of the day in a restless haze, my mind replaying the words on that crumpled note over and over. It felt surreal, like a scene from one of those slow-burn romances I used to read in secret, my heart clinging to the possibility of something more. That evening, I stood in front of my closet, staring at the rows of plain t-shirts and worn jeans. I had never been one to fuss over my appearance, but tonight felt different. I wanted to look good, even if I didn't fully understand why. I finally settled on a black shirt that fit just right and a pair of jeans that hadn't yet worn thin at the knees. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to tame the stubborn curls, before giving up with a sigh. When I stepped out into the hallway, the air felt heavier, the dull hum of the building's old pipes echoing in the distance. I reached his door, hesitating for a second before knocking lightly. My pulse thudded in my ears as I waited, each second stretching into an eternity. The door swung open, and there he was, leaning against the doorframe, his usual confident smirk softening as his eyes met mine. "Hey," he said, stepping back to let me in. "Glad you made it." I nodded, swallowing the nervous lump in my throat as I stepped inside. His apartment was a reflection of him, all dark leather and sharp corners, a motorcycle helmet casually tossed onto the couch, the faint scent of gasoline and pine hanging in the air. He gestured to the small balcony, where 2 folding chairs and a battered cooler sat waiting. "Grab a seat," he said, cracking open the cooler to reveal a few bottles of beer, their glass necks clinking together. He passed one to me before settling into his chair, the metal creaking slightly under his weight. I took a slow sip, the cold bitterness settling my nerves just enough to meet his eyes. The city stretched out before us, a sea of lights blinking like distant stars, the muffled roar of traffic below adding a strange, comforting soundtrack to the silence between us. "So," he said after a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon, "what's a guy like you doing in a place like this?" I chuckled, the tension in my chest easing just a bit. "Could ask you the same thing." He grinned, taking a long pull from his bottle before leaning back, his arm resting casually on the metal railing. Fair enough. We slipped into an easy conversation, the awkwardness of our earlier encounters melting away with each sip of beer. He told me about his first bike, a rusted old Harley he'd spent a summer rebuilding with his uncle, and the freedom he felt every time he hit the open road. I found myself sharing more than I expected, stories of my quiet childhood, my small victories at work, my fears about the future. At some point, the conversation slowed, the silences growing longer but somehow comfortable. I caught myself watching the way the faint city lights reflected off his stubbled jaw, the curve of his lips as he took another drink, the relaxed way he leaned back in his chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. I looked away quickly, my cheeks burning as I realized how obvious my stare must have been. But when I glanced back, I found him watching me, his eyes dark and unreadable in the low light. "You ever feel like you're just waiting for something?" he asked, his voice low and thoughtful, as if he was asking more than just a simple question. I hesitated, my fingers nervously picking at the label on my bottle. "Yeah," I admitted quietly, my heart thudding in my chest. "All the time." He didn't say anything for a while, just took another slow drink, his gaze never leaving mine. Then he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his head tilted just slightly as if weighing his next words carefully. "I don't know what I'm waiting for," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "But lately," he trailed off, his eyes flicking down to his hands, the calluses on his knuckles catching the faint glow of the streetlights below. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. But he didn't finish the thought, just leaned back again, his jaw tightening as if he had just let something slip that he couldn't take back. We sat in silence for a long time after that, the cool night air wrapping around us like a comforting, uncertain embrace. I felt the weight of his words, the unspoken possibilities hanging between us, and I knew that something had shifted, a small, undeniable step toward a line I wasn't sure either of us were ready to cross. As the night grew colder, he finally stood, stretching his arms above his head with a quiet grunt. "We should probably call it," he said, his tone back to its usual easy drawl, but his eyes lingering on mine for a moment too long. "Early shift tomorrow." I nodded, my heart still racing as I set my empty bottle down beside his. "Yeah, thanks for, inviting me." He gave me a small, almost shy smile, the kind I had never seen from him before. "Anytime." I walked back to my apartment that night feeling lighter, my mind buzzing with 1,000 unspoken thoughts, my pulse still racing from the ghost of his gaze. I knew I was treading dangerous ground, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't care. The days that followed felt like a blur, a strange mix of anticipation and dread. I couldn't shake the memory of his dark, searching eyes or the rough edge to his voice when he spoke of waiting for something he couldn't name. I found myself lingering in the hallway more often, listening for the familiar thud of his boots, hoping for another casual encounter, another chance to crack the carefully constructed wall between us. One evening, as I fumbled with my keys outside my door, I heard his door swing open. I looked up just in time to catch his crooked smile, his hair still damp from a shower, the faint scent of soap and aftershave clinging to him. Heading out? He asked, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed casually over his chest. Yeah, I stammered, my pulse quickening. Just grabbing some groceries. He nodded, his eyes flicking to the small paper bag in my hand. Mind if I tag along? Been meaning to stock up myself. I hesitated for a split second, my mind racing through 1,000 possible outcomes before I managed to nod. Yeah, sure. We ended up walking side by side down the cracked sidewalk, the cool evening air prickling my skin. He talked about his job, the long hours, the rough customers, the way the city never really seemed to sleep. I listened, letting his words fill the silence, grateful for the distraction from the nervous flutter in my chest. The small corner store was mostly empty, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as we wandered down the narrow aisles. I reached for a can of soup just as he grabbed a bottle of hot sauce, our arms brushing for a brief, electrifying moment. I felt my breath catch, the sudden warmth of his skin against mine sparking a flurry of confusion and longing. Sorry, I mumbled, stepping back quickly, my cheeks burning as I fumbled the can into my basket. You're good, he said, his voice softer than usual, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. We continued shopping in relative silence, the air between us thick with unspoken thoughts. At the register, he insisted on covering my items, brushing off my protests with a casual, "I owe you one for that beer the other night." I couldn't find the words to argue, my mind too tangled in the way his fingers brushed mine as he passed me the small plastic bag. We walked back to the building in the same uneasy silence, the city lights casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. As we reached our floor, he paused outside his door, one hand resting on the handle, his head tilted slightly as if weighing his next words. "Hey," he said finally, his voice rough, almost hesitant. You want to come in for a bit?" My heart skipped a beat, my mind scrambling for a response. I managed a small nod, swallowing hard as he pushed the door open, stepping aside to let me in. His apartment felt smaller than before, the shadows longer, the air thicker. He kicked off his boots, tossing his keys onto the small table by the door, his eyes flicking to me as I stood awkwardly in the middle of the living room, my hands twisting nervously in my jacket pockets. "Make yourself at home," he said, disappearing into the kitchen. I heard the clink of glass, the soft hiss of a bottle cap, and then he was back, pressing a cold beer into my hand before collapsing onto the couch. I sat beside him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. We sipped our beers in silence, the muted hum of the refrigerator filling the small space between us. I stole a glance at him, catching the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers drummed nervously against his thigh. "You ever think about getting out of here?" he asked suddenly, his eyes fixed on the darkened window across the room. "Like, just packing up and starting fresh somewhere new?" I hesitated, my mind spinning. "Sometimes. But it's hard to walk away from everything you know." He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line, his gaze distant. "Yeah, but I think about it a lot." For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching out between us, heavy with all the things we weren't saying. I felt the weight of his unspoken words, the quiet desperation in his voice, and I knew I was teetering on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. Before I could find the courage to say something, anything, he leaned forward, his shoulder brushing mine, his head dropping into his hands. I froze, my heart racing, my mind a blur of fear and anticipation. "I don't know what the hell I'm doing," he muttered, his voice muffled, his fingers digging into his hair. "I'm just tired, I guess." I reached out without thinking, my hand resting gently on his shoulder, the heat of his skin burning through the thin fabric of his shirt. He tensed for a second, his muscles rigid under my touch, before he exhaled, a long, shaky breath that sent a shiver down my spine. "It's okay," I whispered, my own voice trembling. "You're not alone." For a moment, he didn't move, his head still buried in his hands, his body a tense, coiled spring beneath my touch. Then, slowly, he straightened, his eyes meeting mine, dark and unreadable in the dim light. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice rough, his jaw clenching as if the word itself had cost him something. "I mean it." I just nodded, my hand slipping back into my lap, my heart still racing as the distance between us felt both impossibly wide and unbearably close. In that moment, I knew we had crossed a line, one that neither of us could step back from, and I had no idea where it would lead. The days that followed felt like a strange dance, each step pulling us closer, the space between us shrinking until I could almost feel the heat of his body even when he wasn't there. Our conversations grew longer, our silences deeper, each glance carrying a weight that neither of us dared name. One evening, as I returned from work, I found him sitting on the stairs just outside my door, his head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the cracked tile. For a moment, I just stood there, my heart pounding at the unexpected sight, the vulnerability of him so out of place in the harsh glow of the flickering hallway light. He opened his eyes as my footsteps echoed down the hall, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. He straightened, brushing his hands against his jeans before standing, his shoulders stiff, his jaw set. "Hey," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Got a minute?" I hesitated, my mind racing, before managing a small nod. "Yeah, sure." He pushed his door open, the familiar creak of the hinges sounding louder in the quiet hallway, and gestured for me to follow. I stepped inside, my pulse quickening as the door clicked shut behind me, the faint scent of his aftershave hanging in the air. He paced the small living room for a moment, his hands flexing and clenching at his sides as if struggling to find the right words. I sank into the corner of his worn leather couch, my fingers nervously picking at a loose thread as I watched him wrestle with whatever thoughts had driven him to wait for me in the hallway. "Look," he started, his voice tight, his eyes fixed on a spot somewhere over my shoulder. I don't know how to say this without it coming out wrong. I felt my stomach twist, fear and hope tangling into a tight knot in my chest. I opened my mouth to speak, but he cut me off, his words rushing out in a nervous tumble. "I've been thinking about us. About whatever this is," he said, finally meeting my eyes, his jaw clenching as if bracing for a punch. "And I can't keep pretending like it doesn't matter. Like I don't feel something." My heart slammed against my ribs, my mind struggling to process the words I had so desperately hoped to hear but never actually believed I would. "I don't know what it means," he continued, his voice dropping to a rough whisper, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "But I can't keep ignoring it. I can't keep pretending like you don't matter." The room felt impossibly small, the air too thick, my pulse thundering in my ears. I opened my mouth, struggling to find my voice, to say something that wouldn't shatter this fragile, terrifying moment. "You matter to me too," I managed, my voice shaking, my hands gripping the edge of the couch so tightly my knuckles ached. More than I want to admit. For a long, breathless moment, he just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. Then, without another word, he crossed the small distance between us, his hands hesitating for a split second before gripping my shoulders, his fingers digging into my skin, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I don't know what I'm doing," he whispered, his breath warm against my cheek, his grip tightening as if he feared I might slip away. "But I can't keep pretending like this isn't real." Before I could second-guess myself, I reached up, my shaking hands finding his face, my fingers brushing against the rough stubble on his jaw. I felt him shudder, his eyes falling shut for a heartbeat before he leaned in, his forehead pressing against mine, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, our bodies frozen in the fragile space between fear and desire, our hearts pounding in a shared, frantic rhythm. I felt his fingers loosen their grip on my shoulders, his hands sliding down my arms, his thumbs brushing against the thin fabric of my shirt, sending a shiver down my spine. When he finally pulled back, his eyes searched mine, his jaw clenching and unclenching as if struggling to find words that would make sense of the chaos swirling between us. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice rough, his eyes dropping to the floor as he took a shaky step back. "I shouldn't have. I just don't," I cut in, my own voice trembling, my heart still racing. "Don't apologize. Not for this." He looked up, his eyes wide, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps as if he had just run a marathon. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his forearm, feeling the warmth of his skin, the faint tremble in his muscles. "I'm not going anywhere," I whispered, my throat tight, my heart aching with the unspoken promise hanging between us. For a long, silent moment, he just stared at me, his jaw tightening, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Then, without another word, he turned and walked to the door, his footsteps heavy on the cracked tile, his shoulders tense, his head bowed. I watched him go, my heart still racing, my mind spinning with 1,000 unspoken thoughts, my body tingling from the ghost of his touch. I had no idea what came next, but I knew one thing for certain: we had crossed a line that neither of us could ever step back from, and there was no turning back now. The days after our near confession felt like a slow, silent unraveling. I found myself avoiding the hallway, timing my comings and goings to avoid the risk of running into him. It felt like the walls had closed in, the small distance between our apartments stretching into an unbearable chasm. Then, one night, as I lay awake, staring at the faint cracks in my ceiling, I heard a quiet knock on my door. My heart leapt into my throat, my pulse pounding in my ears as I hesitated, my fingers curling into the thin fabric of my blanket. The knock came again, a little louder this time, followed by the faint, muffled sound of his voice. I scrambled out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor as I stumbled toward the door. I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob, my heart racing. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, then pulled the door open. He stood there, his shoulders hunched, his hair a mess, his eyes wild and desperate in the dim hallway light. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice rough, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I stepped back, my pulse thundering in my ears as he pushed past me into the small, cluttered space of my apartment. I closed the door slowly, my fingers trembling against the cool metal as I turned to face him. He paced the small living room for a moment, his jaw clenching and unclenching, his hands flexing as if struggling to find the right words. I watched him, my heart twisting at the sight of his obvious distress, the raw, unguarded fear in his eyes. "I can't keep doing this," he said finally, his voice tight, his eyes locking onto mine. "I can't keep pretending like this isn't real. Like I don't feel something." I felt my breath catch, my chest tightening as his words echoed through the small room, each one hitting me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to respond, but he cut me off, his hands suddenly gripping my shoulders, his fingers digging into my skin as if clinging to a lifeline. "I don't know what this means," he whispered, his voice breaking, his eyes dark and desperate. "I don't know what I'm doing, but I can't keep ignoring this. I can't keep ignoring you." For a long, breathless moment, we just stood there, his hands gripping my shoulders, our faces inches apart, our breaths mingling in the small, heated space between us. I felt the heat of his body, the roughness of his calloused fingers, the faint, sharp tang of his cologne clinging to his skin. Without thinking, I reached up, my shaking hands finding his face, my fingers brushing against the rough stubble on his jaw. I felt him shudder, his eyes falling shut for a heartbeat before he leaned in, his forehead pressing against mine, his breath warm against my cheek. "I'm scared," he whispered, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the frantic pounding of my own heart. "I don't want to mess this up. I don't want to mess you up." I tightened my grip on his face, my fingers trembling as I leaned in, my lips brushing against his in a slow, hesitant kiss. He froze for a split second, his breath catching in his throat, before his hands slid down my arms, his fingers curling around my wrists, holding me close. The kiss deepened, our bodies pressing together, our breaths coming in short, desperate gasps as the distance between us finally disappeared. I felt his heart racing against my chest, his fingers tightening on my wrists as if terrified I might slip away. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads still pressed together, our breaths mingling in the small, darkened room, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. I met his eyes, my heart still racing, my pulse pounding in my ears as I whispered, "You're not alone." He closed his eyes, his jaw clenching as he leaned into my touch, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts as if struggling to hold himself together. I felt his fingers relax slightly, his grip on my wrists loosening as he leaned in again, his lips brushing against mine in a softer, slower kiss that sent a shiver down my spine. We stood there for what felt like forever, our bodies pressed together, our breaths mingling in the small, quiet space of my apartment, the world outside forgotten. I felt the weight of his unspoken fears, the quiet, desperate hope in his touch, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. As the first hints of dawn crept through the thin, cracked blinds, painting the walls in soft shades of pink and gold, I felt his grip on my wrists loosen, his head dropping to rest against my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough, his body trembling against mine. "Thank you for not giving up on me. I tightened my grip on him, my own eyes falling shut as I leaned into his warmth, my heart aching with a strange, overwhelming sense of belonging. As the morning light filled the room, washing away the shadows of the night, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. No more secrets, no more silence, just the quiet, undeniable truth of us. If you've made it this far into our story, thank you. Your support means everything. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It helps more than you know, and I'd love to keep sharing these moments with you.